The unmarked sedan sat idling at the curb on a tree-lined street in Lincoln, Nebraska, its engine humming softly in the cool March morning of 2024. Detective Maria Hernandez gripped the steering wheel with both hands, staring at the modest ranch-style home with its neat lawn and flower beds just beginning to show the first hints of spring color. 47 years. The number echoed in her mind like a drumbeat. 47 years this person had lived here, taught high school students about literature and ethics, coached debate teams, attended church potlucks, existed as a pillar of this community, while Shannon Carter remained 23 forever, buried in Wyuka Cemetery under a headstone that her parents had visited every week until they died. The DNA report sat in a manila folder on the passenger seat, the results so clear and definitive that there was no room for doubt, no possibility of error. Hernandez took a deep breath and reached for her radio to signal her backup team. This was the arrest that would prove time doesn't erase what you've done, that science eventually catches up with secrets, and that sometimes the monster looks exactly like the kindly retired teacher who everyone in Lincoln thought they knew. Before we continue this story, take a second to hit subscribe and like this video. Cases like this take years of painstaking investigation and cutting-edge forensic work to solve, and your support helps us bring these forgotten stories back into the light where they belong. The call that would change everything had come 3 weeks earlier, on a gray February afternoon, when Hernandez was sitting at her desk in the Lincoln Police Department's cold case unit, surrounded by file boxes that represented decades of unsolved crimes and families still waiting for answers. The forensic genealogy lab had finally completed their analysis of DNA evidence collected from a 1977 murder scene, evidence that had been carefully preserved through nearly 5 decades of technological advancement, waiting for the day when science would be sophisticated enough to reveal its secret. The lab technician's voice on the phone had been professionally calm, but Hernandez could hear the underlying excitement. They had a match. Not a familial match suggesting a relative, but a direct match to a suspect identified through genetic genealogy, confirmed by DNA collected from a discarded coffee cup just days earlier. After 47 years of silence, the man who murdered Shannon Carter had finally been found, and he'd been living in Lincoln the entire time, hiding behind a reputation so sterling that nobody would have ever suspected him of anything more serious than maybe returning a library book late. Shannon Carter had been 23 years old in the summer of 1977, and if you'd known her then, if you'd been one of her friends or family members or just someone who crossed paths with her at the grocery store or the library, you would have thought she was exactly the kind of person who was going, to have a beautiful, meaningful life. She'd graduated from the University of Nebraska in May, walked across that stage in her cap and gown with her parents Robert and Martha crying proud tears in the audience, and her younger brother David whistling so loud he got shushed by the people sitting around him. Her degree was in elementary education, and she had a job lined up starting that fall at Prescott Elementary on the south side of Lincoln, teaching 2nd grade, a position she was so excited about that she'd already started planning her classroom decorations and thinking about how she'd arrange the desks and what books she'd read to her students on the first day. Shannon was the kind of young woman who lit up rooms just by walking into them. She had blonde hair that she usually wore pulled back in a ponytail, blue eyes that seemed to actually sparkle when she laughed, and a smile that made people feel like they mattered, like they were worth her full attention. She was 5'4", slender, with a dusting of freckles across her nose that she tried to cover with makeup but never quite succeeded. Her friends described her as genuinely kind. Not in that performative way some people are kind when they know others are watching, but in the deep-down, authentic way that meant she'd stop to help a stranger change a tire or spend her Saturday volunteering at the animal shelter or remember your birthday when you'd only mentioned it once 6 months ago. She'd been dating her college sweetheart, a business major named Thomas McKinley, since their sophomore year. Tom was steady and dependable, the kind of guy who showed up on time and kept his promises and treated Shannon like she was the most important person in the world. He proposed to her in April of 1977, taking her to the same coffee shop near campus where they'd have their first date, getting down on one knee right there in front of everyone with a simple gold band he'd saved up for months to buy. Shannon had said yes before he'd even finished asking the question, and they'd set the wedding date for April 1978, planning a spring ceremony at St. Mark's Lutheran Church where Shannon's family had attended for 3 generations. Martha Carter had already started collecting recipes for the reception, planning a menu that would feed 200 people, mostly extended family and friends from the tight-knit Lincoln community where the Carters had lived since Shannon's grandfather had moved there in the 1920s. The Carter family lived in a comfortable two-story house on the east side of Lincoln, a neighborhood of tree-lined streets and houses built in the 1940s and 50s where everyone knew everyone else, and children played outside until the streetlights came on. Robert Carter worked as a manager at the Goodyear plant, a steady job that had supported his family comfortably for 20 years. Martha was a homemaker who also did bookkeeping part-time for local businesses, the kind of woman who kept an immaculate house and always had fresh cookies in the cookie jar and knew exactly who in the neighborhood needed a casserole delivered because they were going through a hard time. David, Shannon's brother, was 15 in 1977, a sophomore at Lincoln High, into sports and music, and at that age where he mostly communicated in grunts but absolutely worshipped his big sister even if he died before admitting it out loud. July 14th, 1977, was a Thursday, and it started as an utterly ordinary summer day in Nebraska, the kind where the heat builds gradually through the morning and by afternoon the air feels thick and heavy with humidity that makes your clothes stick to your skin. Shannon had spent the morning at home working on lesson plans for the fall even though she didn't need to, just because she was excited and couldn't wait to start teaching. She'd had lunch with her mother, tuna sandwiches and iced tea at the kitchen table while they talked about wedding plans and whether they should have the reception at the church fellowship hall or rent out the Knights of Columbus hall, which was bigger but more expensive. Around 6 in the evening, Shannon told her parents she was meeting some friends for dinner, just a casual get-together at the Village Inn on O Street, nothing special. She'd probably be home by 10 or so. Martha would remember this moment for the rest of her life, playing it over and over in her mind like a film reel that never stopped spinning. Shannon standing in the doorway, wearing a yellow sundress with small white flowers on it, her blonde hair pulled back in her usual ponytail, her purse slung over her shoulder. She'd kissed her mother's cheek, called out goodbye to her father, who was in the living room reading the newspaper, told David to stop hogging the telephone because she might need to call if plans changed. Martha had said, "Be careful driving," the same thing she always said, a mother's automatic concern. Shannon had smiled and said, "I always am, Mom." And then she was out the door, climbing into her blue Ford Pinto that was parked in the driveway, starting the engine, backing out onto the street, waving once through the window as she drove away. That was it. That was the last time Martha Carter saw her daughter alive, and she'd replay that moment approximately 10,000 times over the next 47 years, searching for something she should have noticed, some sign she should have read, some premonition that should have made her tell Shannon not to go. Shannon did meet her friends at the Village Inn. 4 of them gathered in a booth near the back, college friends who'd scattered to different jobs and apartments but still tried to get together regularly that summer before life really started and adult responsibilities pulled them in different directions. They ate burgers and shared a plate of onion rings and talked about their plans and dreams. That particular kind of conversation people have when they're young and the future feels vast and full of possibility. Shannon told them about her classroom plans, showed them photos of the school, talked about how nervous and excited she was to finally be doing what she'd always wanted to do. Her friends would later tell police that she'd seemed happy, normal, no indication that anything was wrong or that she was worried about anything. They'd finished dinner around 8, split the check, hugged goodbye in the parking lot with promises to do this again soon. Shannon climbed into her Pinto and drove away, and her friends watched her taillights disappear into the summer evening traffic. That was the last confirmed sighting of Shannon Carter alive. What happened in the next few hours would remain a mystery for nearly 5 decades, a blank space in time that investigators would try desperately to fill with witness statements and evidence and theories, but the truth of those hours would stay hidden until DNA technology advanced enough to speak F, or the dead, and name their killer. When Shannon didn't come home by midnight, Martha started to worry. When she didn't come home by 1 in the morning, Martha woke Robert, and they began calling Shannon's friends, trying to track down where she might have gone after dinner. The friends confirmed she'd left the restaurant around 8, said she'd mentioned just going straight home, hadn't talked about stopping anywhere else. By 2 in the morning, Robert called the Lincoln Police Department to report his daughter missing. The officer who took the call was professional but not particularly alarmed. Young women sometimes stayed out late, sometimes went places they didn't tell their parents about, sometimes came home safe and sheepish in the morning with stories about losing track of time. Robert understood this intellectually, but knew in his gut that something was wrong. Shannon wasn't the type to worry them unnecessarily. She'd always called if plans changed. This wasn't like her. At dawn on July 15th, a Friday morning that broke hot and humid with the promise of another scorching Nebraska summer day, a groundskeeper at Wilderness Park noticed a blue Ford Pinto parked in a remote area near the nature trails. The car had been there all night, which wasn't necessarily unusual. Sometimes people parked there for legitimate reasons, but something made him walk over to check on it. The car was locked, but through the windows he could see a purse on the passenger seat, keys still in the ignition. He called the park ranger, who called the police, who ran the plates and discovered the car belonged to Shannon Carter, the young woman whose parents had reported her missing just a few hours earlier. Officers arrived at the scene within 30 minutes. They found the Pinto sitting alone in a gravel parking area, surrounded by trees about 2 miles into the park from the main entrance. The doors were locked, the windows were rolled up. Inside, everything looked normal, undisturbed, no signs of struggle. Shannon's purse was on the passenger seat, and when officers gained entry to the vehicle, they found her wallet inside with cash and credit cards untouched. Her driver's license photo showed a smiling young woman with blonde hair and blue eyes, the same description they now had in the missing person report. The keys in the ignition suggested she'd either been interrupted before she could remove them or had left the car quickly, possibly under duress. But there were no signs of forced entry, no broken glass, no blood, nothing to indicate violence had occurred in or around the vehicle. The discovery of Shannon's abandoned car escalated the case immediately. This was no longer a young woman who might have stayed out late and forgotten to call home. This was something darker. The Lincoln Police Department mobilized search teams, bringing in officers from surrounding jurisdictions, organizing civilian volunteers, combing through Wilderness Park with German shepherds and officers on horseback and people walking shoulder to shoulder through the wooded areas calling Shannon's name. Robert and Martha Carter stood at the park entrance handing out flyers with their daughter's photograph. Please, if you've seen her, please, if you know anything, their voices getting hoarser as the day wore on and the searches yielded nothing. The heat was oppressive that Friday, temperatures climbing into the mid-90s by afternoon, the kind of heat that makes search work exhausting and dangerous. Volunteers had to take frequent breaks, drinking water from coolers set up at staging areas, trying to stay focused despite the sun beating down and the growing sense that they were looking for someone who wasn't going to be found alive. The dogs tracked scents through the woods but kept losing the trail. The helicopter brought in from the State Patrol spotted nothing from the air. By nightfall on Friday, Shannon had been missing for more than 24 hours, and everyone involved in the search knew that with each passing hour, the chances of finding her alive dropped precipitously. Saturday the 15th dawned gray and cooler, clouds rolling in with the threat of rain that would complicate search efforts even further. The search teams regrouped, dividing into sectors, pushing deeper into the park's more remote areas. Wilderness Park covered nearly 1,500 acres, much of it dense woodland and rough terrain, the kind of landscape where you could hide something and it might not be found for weeks or months or ever. The searchers moved slowly, carefully, looking for any sign, any clue, anything that might tell them where Shannon Carter had gone after her car was abandoned. At 2:30 in the afternoon on Saturday, July 16th, two hikers who'd volunteered for the search were working through a heavily wooded area about 2 miles southeast of where Shannon's car had been found. The woods were thick there, oak and cottonwood trees creating heavy shade, underbrush making it slow going. One of the hikers, a man named Gary Richardson, noticed something yellow through the trees, a color that didn't belong in the muted greens and browns of the forest. He called out to his partner, and they moved closer, pushing through the brush. And then they saw her. Shannon Carter was lying in a small clearing, partially concealed by vegetation. She was still wearing the yellow sundress with white flowers that her mother would remember for the rest of her life. She was on her back, her arms at her sides, her blonde hair spread out around her head. She wasn't moving, she wasn't breathing. She'd been dead for at least a day, probably longer. Richardson immediately radioed for police, and then he and his partner backed away from the scene, trying not to contaminate evidence, trying not to look too closely at the young woman who just days ago had been planning her classroom and her wedding and her future. The crime scene was established quickly, yellow tape cordoning off the area, detectives and forensic technicians moving in to document everything before the threatened rain arrived and potentially destroyed evidence. Shannon's body was photographed from every angle. The surrounding area was searched for any items that might have been dropped or discarded. The medical examiner arrived to make preliminary assessments before the body could be moved. What they found told a story of violence and struggle, of a young woman who'd fought for her life in these woods and lost. The specific details were kept from the public and from Shannon's family, not out of dishonesty but out of mercy, because some things don't need to be known by the people who loved her. Some images don't need to live in their minds for the rest of their lives. What the investigators did document carefully was biological evidence, material that in 1977 couldn't tell them much beyond blood type, but that they preserved anyway, because you never knew what future technology might make possible. They collected samples, labeled them, stored them according to protocol, creating a chain of custody that would prove crucial 47 years later. They photographed the scene exhaustively, measured distances, noted the position of the body relative to landmarks. They were thorough and professional and methodical, doing everything right, not knowing that, despite their best efforts, this case would remain unsolved for nearly 5 decades. Robert and Martha Carter were informed that evening that their daughter had been found deceased. The words the officer used were clinical, designed to convey information without unnecessary detail. But nothing could soften the blow of learning that your child is dead, that the young woman who'd kissed you goodbye 2 days ago is never coming home, that all the plans and dreams and futures you'd imagined together have been erased in an act of violence that makes no sense and has no justification. Martha collapsed when she heard the news, literally fell to her knees in her living room, and Robert had to hold her while she screamed, a sound that David, listening from upstairs, would hear echoing in his nightmares for the rest of his life. The news hit Lincoln like a physical blow. This was 1977, a time when people still believed their communities were fundamentally safe, when a young woman could go out for dinner with friends and expect to come home, when evil was something that happened in big cities or in other places, but not here, not in Lincoln, Nebraska, where everyone knew everyone and people looked out for each other. The murder of Shannon Carter shattered that illusion completely. Suddenly, parents were keeping closer watch on their children. Women were afraid to go out alone at night. Doors that had never been locked were bolted shut. The sense of security that had defined this community evaporated, replaced by fear and suspicion, and the terrible awareness that someone capable of murder was walking among them. The Lincoln Police Department threw every resource they had at the investigation. Detective James Morrison caught the case, a 15-year veteran with a reputation for thoroughness and determination. Morrison was 40 years old, married with 3 kids, a man who took his job seriously and believed deeply in justice and accountability. He stood at the crime scene that Saturday afternoon, looking at Shannon Carter's body before it was taken to the morgue, and he made a silent promise that he would find who did this, that this young woman would not become another unsolved statistic. The investigation in those first weeks after Shannon Carter's murder moved with the frantic intensity that all homicide cases demand when the trail is fresh and witnesses' memories are sharp and there's still hope that evidence will lead somewhere definitive. Detective James Morrison worked 18-hour days through late July and into August, interviewing everyone who'd known Shannon, everyone who'd been at the Village Inn that Thursday night, everyone who'd been anywhere near Wilderness Park during the relevant time frame. He built timelines on a corkboard in the police station conference room, connected names with colored string, tracked Shannon's movements, and tried to identify the gap between when she'd left the restaurant at 8 and when her car had been found abandoned the next morning. Somewhere in those hours, she'd encountered someone who'd killed her, and Morrison was determined to figure out who. Thomas McKinley, Shannon's fiancé, was interviewed extensively in those first days, which was standard procedure because statistically the person most likely to murder a young woman is someone she knows intimately. Tom sat in the interview room and answered every question Morrison asked, tears streaming down his face as he described the last time he'd seen Shannon, the plans they'd made, the future that was now never going to happen. His alibi was solid. He'd been at his parents' house the night Shannon disappeared, having dinner with his family, a gathering attended by 8 people who all confirmed he'd been there from 6 in the evening until after midnight. Morrison cleared him quickly, but the process left Tom feeling violated and angry. The idea that anyone could think he'd hurt Shannon when he'd loved her more than anything in the world. Shannon's friends from the Village Inn were interviewed, each one providing the same basic story. They'd had a normal dinner, normal conversation. Shannon had seemed happy and relaxed. She'd left around 8 saying she was heading home. None of them had noticed anyone watching Shannon or following her or paying unusual attention. The restaurant staff was interviewed, servers and cooks and the manager, but nobody remembered anything unusual about that Thursday night. It had been busy, typical summer dinner rush, and Shannon's table had been just one of dozens they'd served that evening. The groundskeepers and rangers who worked at Wilderness Park were interviewed with particular intensity, because whoever had killed Shannon had known that remote area well enough to hide her body 2 miles into dense woodland. There were 6 men who worked at the park regularly that summer, ranging in age from 19 to 58, doing maintenance and trail work and managing the public areas. Morrison interviewed each one multiple times, checking their schedules and their alibis and their backgrounds. All but one had explanations for their whereabouts that night, confirmed by family members or friends or time cards that showed they'd clocked out and gone home. The one who didn't have a solid alibi was a 21-year-old groundskeeper named Robert William Hutchinson, who lived alone in a small apartment near downtown Lincoln and claimed he'd been home by himself the night Shannon disappeared watching television, no witnesses who could confirm his story. Morrison focused intensely on Hutchinson for several weeks in August of 1977. There was something about the young man that set off alarm bells, not anything concrete that Morrison could articulate in a report, just an instinct honed by 15 years of reading people and knowing when someone wasn't being entirely truthful. Hutchinson was cooperative but nervous during interviews, his hands shaking slightly, his eyes not quite meeting Morrison's gaze. He'd worked at Wilderness Park for 2 summers, knew every trail and remote area, would have had the knowledge and opportunity to commit this crime. But knowledge and opportunity weren't evidence, and Morrison couldn't build a case on instinct and suspicion. The problem was the physical evidence, or rather the lack of it. The biological material collected from the crime scene and from Shannon's body could be typed, and the blood type didn't match Hutchinson's, which in 1977 was enough to eliminate him as a suspect because DNA analysis didn't exist yet, and blood typing was the best forensic science had to offer. Morrison had to let Hutchinson go, had to watch him walk out of the police station knowing in his gut that this might be the man who'd killed Shannon Carter, but having no way to prove it. The frustration ate at Morrison like acid, kept him awake at night staring at the ceiling while his wife slept beside him, and he replayed every interview, every piece of evidence, trying to find something he'd missed. By the fall of 1977, the investigation had slowed considerably. Every obvious lead had been exhausted. Every person in Shannon's orbit had been interviewed and cleared. The forensic evidence pointed to an unknown male but couldn't identify him. Tips continued to come in from the public, people reporting suspicious individuals or claiming to have information, but each tip led nowhere, just dead ends and false hopes and wasted hours chasing shadows. The case remained technically active, but the daily work stopped. Morrison moved on to newer homicides, cases where the trail wasn't already cold, but he kept Shannon's file on his desk and her photograph pinned to his bulletin board, a constant reminder of the promise he'd made and failed to keep. For Robert and Martha Carter, time after Shannon's death didn't move forward in any normal sense. It fractured into before and after, the world where their daughter existed and the world where she didn't, and they were trapped in that after space, trying to figure out how to keep living when the center of their universe had been ripped away. Martha stopped doing bookkeeping work, couldn't focus on numbers and ledgers when her mind kept returning to that yellow sundress and the last kiss on her cheek and all the things she should have said but hadn't. Robert went back to work at the Goodyear plant because they needed the income and because sitting home meant drowning in grief. But his coworkers noticed he was different, quieter, older somehow, as if Shannon's death had aged him a decade in a matter of weeks. David, 15 years old and trying to navigate high school while his family fell apart, retreated into himself. He stopped playing sports, stopped hanging out with friends, spent hours alone in his room listening to music and trying to understand how the world could be so fundamentally unfair. He'd worshipped his sister, looked up to her in the way younger siblings do, and her absence left a hole in his life that nothing could fill. He started having nightmares, terrible dreams where Shannon was calling for help and he couldn't reach her, where he could see what was happening but couldn't stop it. He'd wake up gasping and his mother would be there, having heard him cry out, and they'd sit together in the dark, not talking because what was there to say? The first anniversary of Shannon's death in July of 1978 was marked with a memorial service at St. Sean, Mark's Lutheran Church, the same church where Shannon and Tom were supposed to have been married that spring. Instead of a wedding celebration, there was a service of remembrance. The pews filled with people who'd known and loved Shannon, who wanted to honor her memory and support her family and try to make sense of something that had no sense to make. Martha couldn't speak during the service, could barely breathe through the crushing weight of grief, so Robert stood at the pulpit and talked about their daughter, about the light she'd brought into their lives, about how much they missed her and how desperately they wanted whoever had killed her to be caught and held accountable. Every year after that, the anniversary service became a ritual. July 18th, the day Shannon's body had been found, became a day of mourning and remembrance for the Carter family and for the broader Lincoln community that had been traumatized by her murder. In the early years, hundreds of people attended, filling the church sanctuary and spilling out into the fellowship hall. But as time passed, as 1977 became 1980, became 1985, became 1990, the crowds thinned. People moved away or died or simply forgot, because you can't carry someone else's grief forever when you have your own life to live. By the 20th anniversary in 1997, it was mostly just family, a handful of Shannon's college friends who still lived in the area, and Detective Morrison, who attended every single year without fail, standing in the back of the church with his head bowed, still carrying the weight of his unsolved case. Morrison retired from the Lincoln Police Department in 2003, 26 years after Shannon's murder, and the case remained unsolved. He'd worked hundreds of homicides in his career, but Shannon Carter's was the one that haunted him, the one he couldn't let go. In his garage at home, Morrison kept boxes of unofficial files, copies he'd made over the years of reports and witness statements and evidence logs. His wife, Karen, had hoped retirement would mean leaving the job behind, that they could finally travel and spend time with their grandchildren without Jim disappearing into his head. But she'd known him for 40 years and recognized that some cases become part of you in a way that retirement can't. Race. When DNA testing became available in the early 1990s, Morrison had been one of the first detectives in Lincoln to push for retesting old evidence using the new technology. He'd personally driven the preserved biological samples from Shannon's case to the state lab, waited impatiently for results, felt a surge of hope when they successfully generated a DNA profile from material that was nearly 15 years old at that point. The profile was entered into CODIS, the national DNA database that was being built to connect criminals across jurisdictions. Morrison waited for a match, certain that this was finally the breakthrough that would crack the case. But weeks passed with no hit, then months, then years. The DNA profile sat in the system, waiting for a match that never came, because whoever had killed Shannon Carter either had no criminal record or had committed this crime before DNA collection became standard practice. Morrison died in January of 2019, 77 years old, his health failing but his mind still sharp, still thinking about Shannon Carter, still wondering who'd killed her and why. Karen found him one morning in his garage, slumped over the folding table where he kept Shannon's case files spread out, and she knew he'd been working on it even at the end, unable to let it go even when his body was giving out. At Morrison's funeral, David Carter attended and spoke briefly with Karen, thanking her for sharing her husband with Shannon's case all those years, acknowledging that Morrison had cared more than anyone had a right to expect. Karen held David's hands and told him that Jim had never stopped believing the case would be solved someday, that science would eventually catch up with the truth, that he just hoped to live long enough to see it. The case passed to Detective Maria Hernandez when she joined Lincoln's cold case unit in 2020. Hernandez was 32 years old, had grown up in Lincoln, and vaguely remembered the Shannon Carter case from her childhood, those anniversary services that made the news every July, the unsolved murder that had become part of local legend. When she opened Morrison's meticulously maintained files, she was struck by how thorough the investigation had been, how he'd done everything right by the standards of his era. The problem wasn't investigative failure, it was technological limitation, and in 2020, technology had advanced far beyond what Morrison had access to. Hernandez had been following developments in genetic genealogy ever since the Golden State Killer arrest in 2018 had demonstrated how powerful the technique could be. She decided it was time to try something new with Shannon Carter's case. Time to use science that hadn't existed when Shannon was murdered to finally identify her killer and bring justice that was 43 years overdue. The process of applying genetic genealogy to Shannon Carter's case began in early 2021, When Detective Maria Hernandez submitted a formal proposal to the Lincoln Police Department's Cold Case Review Board, requesting budget allocation and permission to send the preserved DNA evidence to Othram Labs, a company specializing in forensic-grade genome sequencing. The technique was still relatively new in law enforcement circles, controversial in some quarters because of privacy concerns about using consumer DNA databases for criminal investigations. But Hernandez had done her research and knew this was Shannon's best chance for justice. The DNA profile generated back in the 1990s was good enough for CODIS comparison, but not detailed enough for genealogical analysis. Othram could extract additional genetic material from the original samples, amplify it using proprietary techniques, and create a comprehensive genome sequence that could be uploaded to public genealogy databases to find distant relatives of the killer. The review board approved her request in March of 2021, and Hernandez personally transported the evidence to Othram's facility, treating those preserved samples like they were made of glass, because in a very real sense, they were Shannon Carter's last testimony, the biological fingerprint left by her killer that had waited 44 years to tell its story. The lab process was slow and painstaking, extracting usable DNA from degraded samples, sequencing the genome base pair by base pair, building a genetic profile comprehensive enough to identify familial relationships going back multiple generations. Hernandez checked in weekly for updates, trying to be patient, reminding herself that good forensic work couldn't be rushed and that Shannon had already waited this long. A few more months wouldn't matter, except they did matter. Every day mattered when you were trying to give a family closure they'd been denied for nearly half a century. The enhanced DNA profile was completed in August of 2021, and Hernandez immediately uploaded it to GED Match and Family Tree DNA, the two major genealogy databases that permitted law enforcement access under specific protocols. Within 72 hours, the system identified matches, distant relatives who shared segments of DNA with Shannon's unknown killer. These weren't close matches, not parents or siblings, but third and fourth cousins, people separated by 4 or 5 generations who shared common ancestors, born sometime in the 1800s. To anyone else, these would have been meaningless connections, relatives so distant you'd never meet them at family reunions or know their names. But to a genetic genealogist, they were breadcrumbs leading back through time to family trees that could be reconstructed and analyzed and ultimately used to identify a killer who thought he'd gotten away with murder. Hernandez hired Dr. Toffing. Patricia Chen, a genetic genealogy consultant who'd worked successfully on several high-profile cold cases, including 2 murders in Iowa and 1 in South Dakota. Chen was 56 years old, a former librarian who discovered a talent for genealogical research while tracing her own family history and had transitioned into forensic work after the Golden State Killer breakthrough demonstrated the technique's revolutionary potential. She had the patience and attention to detail that this work required, the ability to spend 12 hours staring at census records and birth certificates and marriage licenses, finding connections that others would miss, building family trees that stretched back generations and forward to the present day. Chen began her work on the Shannon Carter case in September of 2021, starting with those distant DNA matches and working backward to identify the common ancestors they shared with the killer. The process took months of meticulous research. Chen dove into historical records from Nebraska and surrounding states, tracing families through the 1800s and early 1900s, following surname changes through marriages, tracking geographic migrations as families moved from farms to cities, assembling a massive genealogical puzzle where each piece was a human life. She'd send Hernandez periodic updates, usually dense reports with hand-drawn family trees showing multiple generations, highlighting individuals who warranted further investigation. By early 2022, Chen had identified 2 main family lines that connected back to pioneer families in eastern Nebraska in the 1870s. The challenge now was working forward through those family trees, identifying all living male descendants who would have been the right age in 1977 and who had connections to Lincoln. The initial list included 73 names, men who ranged from their late 50s to their late 70s in 2022, all descended from those common ancestors Chen had identified. Many could be eliminated immediately, men who died before 1977, or who were living in other states with documentation proving they couldn't have been in Nebraska when Shannon was killed. Others were eliminated through additional genealogical research, that showed they weren't actually direct descendants, or that DNA inheritance patterns made them unlikely candidates. By June of 2022, the list had been narrowed to 12 viable suspects, men who'd been living in or around Lincoln in 1977, who were the right age, who had no alibis that immediately cleared them. Hernandez and our team began the delicate process of background investigation without alerting their subjects. They pulled DMV records, employment histories, property records, anything public that would tell them about these men's lives in 1977 and in the decades since. They looked for connections to Wilderness Park, to Shannon Carter's social circles, to anything that might explain why one of these men had crossed paths with a young woman on a July evening and made the devastating decision to kill her. Most of the 12 could be eliminated fairly quickly through this process. Men who'd moved away from Lincoln years before the murder, or who had solid employment records placing them elsewhere, or who simply didn't fit the profile based on other factors Hernandez couldn't ignore. By the fall of 2022, one name had risen to the top of the list, a man who not only fit every parameter, but whose background made Hernandez's instincts scream that this was their killer. Robert William Hutchinson, now 66 years old, had lived in Lincoln his entire life. In 1977, he'd been 21 years old working as a groundskeeper at Wilderness Park, the same park where Shannon's car had been found and where her body had been discovered 2 miles into the woods. Hernandez pulled the original case files and found that Detective Morrison had interviewed Hutchinson extensively in August of 1977, had suspected him, had focused on him for weeks, but ultimately had to clear him because his blood type didn't match the evidence. But blood typing was primitive compared to DNA analysis, and Hernandez knew that Hutchinson's elimination based on 1977 forensic science meant nothing now. Digging deeper into Hutchinson's background, Hernandez discovered a life that looked almost aggressively normal on paper. After working at Wilderness Park in the late 1970s, he'd gone to community college, gotten a degree in education, become a high school English teacher. He'd taught at Lincoln Southeast High School for 38 years, retiring in 2018 with a ceremony where former students and colleagues praised his dedication and his impact on generations of teenagers. He'd married Jennifer Walsh in 1982, and they'd been together for 40 years, raised 2 daughters who were now adults with families of their own. He sang in the choir at First Presbyterian Church, volunteered with Habitat for Humanity, coached high school debate teams for 15 years. He had 3 grandchildren he doted on, posting photos on Facebook of fishing trips and birthday parties, playing the role of devoted grandfather so convincingly that anyone looking at his life would see exactly what he wanted them to see. A good man who'd contributed to his community and lived with integrity. But Hernandez had learned long ago that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like beloved teachers and church volunteers and grandfathers, hiding behind respectability so convincing that even people who knew them intimately would swear they were incapable of violence. The disconnect between who Robert Hutchinson appeared to be and what the genetic genealogy suggested he'd done was profound, but it wasn't unprecedented. The Golden State Killer had been a former cop. BTK had been a church president and father. Evil camouflages itself behind normalcy and waits for opportunities that only it recognizes. The challenge now was obtaining a DNA sample from Hutchinson that could be directly compared to the crime scene evidence. Genetic genealogy had pointed to him through familial relationships. But to make an arrest that would hold up in court, Hernandez needed a direct match, not an inference. She couldn't just knock on his door and ask for a DNA swab. She needed to collect abandoned DNA, material discarded in public that was legally considered trash and therefore accessible without a warrant. This required surveillance, patience, and timing. Through January and February of 2023, Hernandez had a rotating team watch Hutchinson, following him through his daily routines, waiting for him to throw away a coffee cup or a water bottle or anything with saliva that could yield DNA. They watched him drive to his part-time job at the public library, where he volunteered shelving books 3 days a week. They watched him attend church on Sundays, singing hymns with his wife beside him, shaking hands with the pastor after services. They watched him have lunch with former teaching colleagues, play with his grandchildren at the park, live his life with no apparent awareness that 46 years after committing murder, justice was finally closing in. The surveillance was delicate work. They couldn't get too close or maintain too obvious a presence. Hutchinson couldn't know he was being watched, couldn't be spooked into changing his patterns or becoming cautious about what he discarded. The breakthrough came on March 15, 2023, a Wednesday morning when Hutchinson stopped at a coffee shop on his way to the library. The surveillance team watched him order a large coffee, sit in his car in the parking lot drinking it while scrolling through his phone, then toss the empty cup in the trash can outside the shop entrance before driving away. The team waited exactly 10 minutes to ensure he wasn't coming back, then retrieved the cup, carefully bagging it as evidence, documenting chain of custody, treating it with the reverence it deserved because this discarded piece of trash might be the key that finally unlocked a 46-year-old mystery. The cup was rushed to the Nebraska State Patrol Crime Lab with urgent priority, and Hernandez spent the next 2 weeks in a state of controlled anxiety, checking her phone obsessively, unable to focus on other cases because everything hinged on whether that DNA would match. The call came on March 29th, a Thursday afternoon when Hernandez was at her desk reviewing files on an unrelated case. The forensic scientist's voice was professionally calm, but she could hear the excitement underneath. The DNA from the coffee cup matched the DNA from Shannon Carter's murder scene. Not a familial match suggesting a relative, but a direct match. The kind that occurs with odds of 1 in several trillion. The kind that leaves no room for reasonable doubt. Robert William Hutchinson had been at that crime scene in July of 1977. His biological material had been left on Shannon Carter's body. After 46 years of silence, the evidence was speaking, and it was naming him as her killer. Hernandez sat at her desk holding the phone long after the scientist had hung up, staring at the lab report that had just been emailed to her, reading the technical language that translated to one simple truth. They had him. After nearly half a century, they finally knew who'd murdered Shannon Carter, and he'd been living in Lincoln the entire time, hiding behind a reputation so sterling that nobody would have suspected him of anything worse than maybe grading papers too harshly. She thought about Detective Morrison, about how he'd died 4 years earlier, never knowing that his instincts about Hutchinson had been right, that the young groundskeeper he'd suspected in 1977 was indeed the killer, but that the forensic technology of that era had failed to prove it. She thought about Robert and Martha Carter, about how Martha had died in 1995 without answers, and how Robert had died in 2021, just 2 years earlier, so close to seeing justice but not quite making it. She thought about David Carter, Shannon's brother, now in his early 60s, who'd spent his entire adult life in the shadow of his sister's unsolved murder, and who was about to finally get the answers he'd waited for since he was 15 years old. Hernandez worked with the Knox County District Attorney's Office over the next week to build an airtight arrest warrant application. Assistant DA James Rutherford, a prosecutor with 20 years of experience in cold cases, reviewed every piece of evidence, every link in the genetic genealogy chain, every document in the chain of custody for the DNA samples. The case they built was comprehensive and undeniable, starting with Morrison's original investigation in 1977, moving through the preservation of evidence and the advances in DNA technology, explaining the genetic genealogy process and how it had identified Hutchinson, and culminating with the direct DNA match from the coffee cup. They submitted the warrant application to Judge Patricia Caldwell on April 5th, and she signed it the same day, the evidence too overwhelming to require extended deliberation. The arrest was planned for April 11th, 2023, a Tuesday morning when Hutchinson would likely be home. Hernandez assembled a team of 6 officers, briefing them on the suspect's background and the nature of the charges. Hutchinson had no history of violence beyond this crime, no weapons registered in his name, no indication he'd resist arrest. But he was a murderer who'd evaded justice for 46 years, and they'd be taking no chances. They'd execute the warrant early, before dawn, minimizing the chance of neighbors witnessing the arrest or Hutchinson having time to barricade himself or destroy evidence that might still exist in his home. At 5 in the morning on April 11th, Hernandez led a convoy of unmarked vehicles through the dark streets of Lincoln, heading toward the modest ranch house in a quiet subdivision where Robert and Jennifer Hutchinson had lived for 30 years. The neighborhood was silent, houses dark except for the occasional porch light, the kind of peaceful suburban setting where nothing dramatic ever happened. Hernandez felt her pulse quicken as they approached the house, her hand instinctively checking her weapon even though she didn't expect to meet it. This was the moment that would finally bring justice for Shannon Carter, The moment that would prove that time doesn't erase what you've done and that DNA doesn't age the way memories do. Hernandez knocked on the door, 3 firm raps that echoed in the pre-dawn quiet. Lights flickered on inside the house. A dog barked somewhere in the back. Footsteps approached. The door opened to reveal Robert Hutchinson in sweatpants and a Lincoln Southeast High School t-shirt, his gray hair disheveled from sleep, confusion crossing his face as he registered the badges and the number of officers on his porch. For a moment he just stood there, and Hernandez watched his face carefully, looking for the reaction, waiting to see recognition or fear or calculation. Then something shifted behind his eyes, something that told her he knew exactly why they were there, that he'd probably been waiting for this moment on some level for 46 years, wondering if he'd really gotten away with it or if someday the knock would come. Hernandez identified herself and informed Hutchinson he was under arrest for the murder of Shannon Carter. She watched his face as she said Shannon's name, saw the flicker of something, there and gone so quickly she almost missed it. Recognition definitely, but something else too. Resignation maybe, or relief that the waiting was finally over. Hutchinson didn't resist as Hernandez placed him in handcuffs. He didn't ask what evidence they had or claim there'd been a mistake or protest his innocence. He was completely silent as they led him to a patrol car, while Jennifer Hutchinson appeared in the doorway in her bathrobe, her face a mask of shock and confusion, asking what was happening. What had Robert done? There must be some mistake. Her husband was a teacher, a good man. This couldn't be Rhea. The news of Hutchinson's arrest made regional headlines by noon and national news by evening. The story had every element that captures public attention. A nearly 50-year-old cold case finally solved, a young woman murdered on the cusp of her life, a suspect who'd hidden behind respectability and taught generations of children while carrying the secret of what he'd done. CNN ran segments. True crime podcasts immediately started producing episodes. Reddit threads exploded with people who'd been Hutchinson students, trying to reconcile the patient teacher who'd helped them understand Shakespeare with the man who'd murdered Shannon Carter in 1977. The comments were filled with disbelief and betrayal. Former students saying he'd been kind to them, had written college recommendation letters, had changed their lives. How could someone like that be capable of murder? But Hernandez had to push aside the media circus because her priority was informing David Carter before he heard about the arrest from news reports. She called him at his home in Omaha, where he'd moved in the 1990s to work as a victim advocate, dedicating his life to helping families navigate the criminal justice system after violent crimes, work he'd been drawn to because of Shannon. David answered on the first ring, and Hernandez could hear the hope and dread in his voice when he realized it was the detective calling. She told him carefully that they'd made an arrest in Shannon's case, that the suspect was in custody, that DNA evidence had definitively linked him to the crime scene. David was silent for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was shaking. "Who?" he asked. "Who killed my sister?" Hernandez told him Robert Hutchinson's name, explained his background, his connection to Wilderness Park in 1977. David said the name meant nothing to him. He'd never heard Shannon mention anyone named Hutchinson, couldn't understand how this stranger had destroyed his family and then lived a normal life for 46 years while his parents died without answers, and he'd spent his entire adulthood trying to make a sense of senseless violence. Hernandez had no satisfactory explanation because sometimes there is no explanation that makes sense. Sometimes evil is just opportunistic and random, and trying to rationalize it only leads to more pain. Hutchinson was arraigned the following day, appearing in court in an orange jumpsuit and shackles, no longer the respected retired teacher but just another criminal defendant. The charges were read, 1 count of first-degree murder, and Hutchinson entered a plea of not guilty on advice of his court-appointed attorney. Bail was denied, given the severity of the charge, and the fact that Hutchinson had lived freely for 46 years after committing the crime, suggesting he was a flight risk. He was remanded to the Lancaster County Jail to await trial. The legal process moved through the summer and fall of 2023. Hutchinson's defense attorney filed the expected motions challenging the genetic genealogy evidence, arguing it was too new and scientifically questionable, that using consumer DNA databases violated privacy rights, that this set a dangerous precedent. But Rutherford was prepared with case law from multiple jurisdictions where genetic genealogy evidence had been admitted and upheld on appeal. He brought in expert witnesses to explain the science, to demonstrate its reliability, to show that the technique was now accepted within the forensic community. Judge Caldwell ruled the evidence admissible in September. The DNA match was solid, the chain of custody was documented, and Hutchinson's genetic material at a murder scene spoke for itself. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the likelihood of conviction at trial, Hutchinson's attorney approached Rutherford about a plea deal in October. The negotiations were brief because Rutherford wouldn't budge on the fundamental terms, and David Carter, when consulted, was adamant that he wanted maximum punishment. On November 1, 2023, Hutchinson accepted a plea agreement. He would plead guilty to first-degree murder in exchange for the death penalty being taken off the table. He would receive life in prison without possibility of parole, meaning he would die behind bars, never again free, never again able to pretend he was the good man everyone thought he was. The plea hearing was scheduled for November 15th, and David Carter flew to Lincoln for it, needing to be present, needing to look Robert Hutchinson in the eye and let him see the destruction he'd caused. The courtroom was packed with media, former students of Hutchinson's who needed to see this for themselves, community members who remembered Shannon Carter and wanted to bear witness to justice finally being served. Hutchinson was led in wearing shackles, and David stared at him, this ordinary-looking elderly man who'd stolen his sister's life and his parents' peace and 46 years of his own life. Judge Caldwell asked if Hutchinson understood the charges and the consequences of his plea. He said yes in a voice barely above a whisper. She asked how he pleaded to the charge of murdering Shannon Carter. Guilty. The word hung in the courtroom air, simple and devastating and 46 years overdue. David read a victim impact statement he'd written, and his voice broke multiple times as he talked about Shannon, about who she'd been and who she should have become, about their parents dying without answers, about how Hutchinson had stolen not just Shannon's life, but the lives his family should have. He had. He talked about becoming a victim advocate because of Shannon, about spending his career helping other families navigate what his family had navigated, about how many times he'd wondered if Shannon's case would ever be solved, or if it would remain forever in that terrible limbo of unanswered questions. He looked directly at Hutchinson as he spoke, and Hutchinson sat with his head bowed, never meeting David's eyes, offering no explanation and no apology that would have meant anything anyway. Judge Caldwell then addressed Hutchinson directly, her voice hard and uncompromising. She spoke about the particular cruelty of his crime, about murdering a young woman on the cusp of her life, about the 46 years he'd stolen from Shannon's family by remaining free, about how he perverted the trust placed in him as a teacher while carrying the knowledge of what he'd done. Then she formally sentenced him to life in prison without possibility of parole, and Hutchinson was led away, back to a cell where he would spend the remaining years of his life. And David felt something release in his chest that had been tight since he was 15 years old. After the hearing, Hernandez met privately with David in a conference room at the courthouse. He thanked her, thanked the genetic genealogists, thanked everyone who'd worked the case across nearly 5 decades. But Hernandez could see the complicated emotions on his face, relief mixed with exhaustion, mixed with the awareness that justice, while important, didn't bring Shannon back, didn't restore the years stolen, didn't heal the trauma or make his parents' deaths any less painful, knowing they'd died without answers. It was simply accountability, the minimum requirement of a just society, and even that had taken 46 years to achieve. On July 18, 2024, the 47th anniversary of Shannon Carter's death, but the first anniversary after justice had been served, David returned to Wyuka Cemetery, where his parents and sister were buried side by side. He stood in the summer heat, the Nebraska sun beating down the way it had that terrible July in 1977, and he told Shannon that they'd finally found him, finally held him accountable, finally proved that her life mattered and her death wouldn't be forgotten. The words felt inadequate, but they were all he had. He'd never stopped missing his sister, never stopped wondering what she would have become, never fully understand why Robert Hutchinson had done what he'd done. But he had answers now, and he had justice, and that was something. That was enough to finally start remembering Shannon not just as a murder victim, but as the vibrant young woman she'd been, the sister who'd made him feel loved, the teacher who never got to teach, the person who deserved to be remembered for how she'd lived, not just for how she died. Where are you watching from today? Leave a comment and let us know if you remember a case like this in your community, a time when justice took decades but finally arrived, proving that DNA doesn't lie, that time doesn't erase what you've done, and that the truth, no matter how long buried, eventually rises to the surface when people refuse to stop digging.